Thank you, Joachim. It's a pleasure to meet everyone. My name is Daniel. I'm the Europe sales manager here at Mabl, so responsible for everything in the European market. And alongside me today doing the technical presentation, I have Andy, one of our solution engineers. Andy, do you want to do a quick intro of yourself?
Yeah, pleasure to meet everyone. My name's Andy. I'm one of the SEs here at Mabl. So I work alongside Daniel, and I'm very much a technical resource to walk through the platform and really make sure that Mabl is going to be a right technical fit that's going to help drive quality across teams. So Dan, if it works for you, I can start sharing my screen and we can jump in.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Awesome. So for today's presentation, the brown bag, I want to walk everyone through a very brief presentation. Hopefully it won't be too boring. And then after that, I'll pass it over to Andy, who can do the more interesting part of actually showing the solution and some test creation activities. So first and foremost is, how does Mabl look at itself, or how does Mabl view itself? We like to think of ourselves as an intelligent test automation platform, specifically designed for agile teams. And one of the biggest visions of Mabl that I think differentiates us from a number of the solutions in the industry is that we take a very holistic, unified platform approach, where we want to enable all forms of testers to be able to do full end-to-end test automation that moves at the speed of DevOps, right? So we want to bring all functional and non-functional testing under a single umbrella. Now, I'm sure that this is preaching to the choir a little bit. I'm sure that a lot of people already sense this challenge, but why was Mabl created in the first place? And it's because our founders, Dan and Izzy, back in 2016, recognized that there's a very big issue within the QA industry, where quality assurance, as development increases in velocity, quality assurance has become a major bottleneck to actually being able to push products and features out into production faster. And as you can see here, the reason that it's a bottleneck is because of the traditional approaches to QA didn't lend themselves to actually accelerating, right? So you had the manual approach, which was very redundant. You had to constantly be recreating testing, a lot of the same steps over and over again. And then you had the traditional scripted approach with the open source solutions, where you had to have a very high skill set in order to be able to code those frameworks. And then on top of that, any minor changes required high levels of maintenance, right? So as you can imagine, thousands and thousands of test scripts take a long time to update. So we really broke it down into a few main symptoms to solve. One is speed. So speed of test creation needed to be accelerated. The second was maintenance. So the time spent maintaining your suite of tests needed to be reduced. The solution needed to be user-focused, so easy to use, easy to understand, and ultimately collaborative, right? The idea of DevOps, and one of the biggest benefits that it brings, is the shift left mentality. So being able to test earlier, more often within the development cycle. And so with that, you needed to break down the silos between all the different groups. And that's exactly what Mabl aims to do. So to take a look at it in three main buckets for what is Mabl's vision for next generation test automation, right? If you look at the framework bucket, you have the ease of use. It needs to be low code or no code. It needs to be accessible. It needs to be fast, reliable, flexible, and comprehensive, right? But I know those are some great buzzwords, but the idea is that the solution itself is easy to understand and easy to grasp and easy to ramp and scale with. From the deployment side, it needs to be easily integrated into current ID tech stacks, right? Individuals or groups and organizations need to be able to connect with existing tool suite, so there's little to no or seamless integration with it and no obstacles that you need to overcome. The infrastructure effort needs to be reduced to a minimum as well, and that's supported by Mabl being a SaaS-based solution. And ultimately, it needs to be secured, right? As you can imagine, most organizations have a lot of security requirements around their solution and their tech stacks, and Mabl understands exactly what those requirements are, and we focus on them. Looks like we lost Andy for a second. Give me 1 second. I'll pull up my screen. Awesome. So from the deployment side, as I was saying, you want to have that integration, the infrastructure, and the security. But one of the biggest benefits of Mabl is our gold standard for support. We try to provide support throughout the entirety of your life cycle and your engagement with Mabl, both from the onboarding perspective, as well as constant QBR check-ins, access to our current user base, so you have a sense of community as you're using Mabl, as well as the multiple different Mabl universities and certifications that come along with it. And then ultimately, from the technology side, right, this is the most important. It needs to be low code, right? You need something that's easy to use and you can accelerate with. It needs to be AI based, right? And this is one of the ideas, the founding ideas of Mabl. When Dan and Izzy actually approached Google Ventures to help start this company back in 2016, AI was at the core of it. For the future cloud, right? Every organization is going through a digital transformation right now that includes some form of cloud migration, right? So everything needs to be cloud-based. And really the reason for that is because you want to be able to capture as much analytics and as much data around every single component that you're testing as possible, right? So Mabl takes all of these ideas and really wraps it into a nice solution and a nice platform, which Andy will be showing to you afterwards. Now, when you take a look at it, the way Mabl does this and the core functions or features that we really focus on are the low-code framework, which you will see, the unified platform, so being able to do full end-to-end tests within a single solution. So what you'll see is Mabl has UI, API, mobile web, native mobile coming soon, performance testing, even accessibility testing, all within one environment. So you don't need to be leaving the solution to continuously focus on each individual type of test. Everything can be done in one place. We really have a very rich set of integrations. We work well with a number of the CI/CD platforms. We have a bi-directional integration with Jira. And we have open APIs and webhooks built in that it's easy to integrate with any solution that you have in place right now, whether it's TCM, test case management, or something else like a CI/CD pipeline. The coolest thing, though, is the auto healing. I think that this is what really guides a lot of people towards us most often. Mabl has won the AI award for 4 years in a row now, I think maybe 5 even. And the reason for it is because AI is at the core of everything Mabl does, right? So we have the auto healing functionality. We also have AI prevalence in other instances of the solution, which Andy will talk to, for example, like intelligent weight. And the reason around that is because AI auto healing in this instance really helps reduce the level of effort a tester needs to do in order to maintain suites of tests, right? And that's one of the biggest pain points that testers today currently feel. This, not me speaking from experience, but what a lot of surveys have indicated. And then ultimately, Mabl is a solution, intense, rich diagnostic data that comes from every single test. You have screenshots, you have console logs, network activity, right? The idea there is we want to break down the silos between different groups, and different individuals or different groups focus on different aspects. So Mabl really tries to capture the comprehensive set list around that. And ultimately, because we're a SaaS-based solution and we sit on GCP, we're enterprise grade, meaning that we can scale with your organization. We provide enterprise level support as well as security. So, wrapping it up in a nice little Mabl differentiators bow. We're fast, easy, robust. We have a full suite of functionality that a lot of traditional solutions, you would say, oh, a low-code solution would get a 70% of the way for testing, and then 30% falls to us to figure it out. Mabl really tries to close that gap to 90 to 95%, right? So we have the email and PDF and API testing within one environment. We base our product development on customer feedback, on what our existing customers and potential customers request from us as something that is a must-have. From the scalability perspective, right, we are SaaS-based solutions, so we eliminate the overhead of infrastructure costs. We also enable parallel test execution, right? That is one of Mabl's biggest value adds, is that we promote parallelization. We want you to be able to test in parallel rather than sequentially, really reducing the amount of time you're taking on running those tests and more time spent on analyzing test results and test data. And then ultimately, that pipelines, intelligent pipelines deliver quality customer experience. And lastly, from the analytical perspective, the unified reporting, the test coverage, as well as everything being AI powered. It's one thing to talk about it, it's another thing to actually capture real customer data. So I want to throw this up here on the screen just for a minute so you have a chance to read it over. But each one of our customers has recognized real benefit from implementing Mabl, whether they're coming from a manual solution or a scripted solution, right? So in Barracuda's case, one of the biggest eye-catching data points is 85% reduction in time spent sanity testing. Whereas with Charles Schwab, because of the shift left approach that Mabl promotes, you have an 85% reduction in mean time to defect resolution, so MTTR, which is a very popular QA manager or even VP of engineering metric. The idea is because they're shifting left, testing earlier more often, they're catching their bugs sooner, so those bugs never even reach production. And then finally, just for the benefit of some of the high-level executives here on the call and those who that may be watching this, we have some really great data around the ROI as well as risk mitigation, right? So faster test creation means that you're reducing the risk for maintenance and sending tests and features into production, 70% tracked in Mabl. 80% cost savings over a traditional Selenium solution, and overall is six times efficiency increase, right? So as you can see here, each individual organization has a different metric that they're looking to track, but in every instance, they were able to see massive benefits when implementing Mabl. So that's it on my side. Let me pause my screen share here for a second and see if Andy was able to hop in. I think he has.
Yeah, thanks for jumping right back in there, Dan. From here, why don't I jump in and actually start to walk you through the platform? So we'll cover a lot of those aspects that Dan had covered. The fact that Mabl is a unified solution, the fact that we are a SaaS-based solution really built to scale with teams, and really focusing in on that test creation and organization component. How does the fact that Mabl is low-code and intelligent really lend itself to agile teams and increasing the speed of development by addressing that bottleneck of testing. So first and foremost, we'll look at this main dashboard you see here in Mabl as from a tester's perspective, this is really the heartbeat of our testing. This dashboard gives us a single pane of glass to understand, how are the results and the efforts across UI, API performance testing, all being seen within our workspace. When we look at this dashboard, I also like to highlight some different aspects like this 1-hour snapshot. The reason I call attention to this is it's just a really nice visual to kind of understand the real benefit of that scalability in that SaaS infrastructure Dan mentioned. Each green bar that you see in this snapshot represents a test that was run in this workspace. And because we don't limit parallelization, that scalability leads itself to teams being able to test earlier and test more efficiently because they have infrastructure that scales with them and not against them. Now, naturally, I can review all the different other environments I'm testing within my workspace, whether it's a very early environment like dev or staging, or even later environments like production. But the last thing I would highlight before we jump into the meat of the demo is to give you some context as to how do we organize and actually automate tests in Mabl. Well, for that, we have the concept of plans, which we'll speak to in more depth later. But at a high level, plans allow us to organize and group our tests. It allows us to scale them, whether that's cross-environment or cross-browser. And it's how we automate those tests. So whether I'm running these on a set schedule or being triggered from some CI/CD pipeline via API, really easy to actually implement that automation and really lower the barrier of entry to actually perform more end-to-end testing earlier in the development process. Now, the last thing I'll mention here when it comes to plans is it allows you to group not just web UI functional tests, but as you can see here, because we're that unified platform, we can group both functional UI tests right alongside our functional API tests, as well as those performance tests, whether those are API or web UI performance tests. Now we'll start building a test now in Mabl with an initial focus on web UI automation. So today I'll create a browser test and I'll give that a name. From here, I'll add it to an existing plan, in this case, my client invoices plan. And I'll also choose to train this test with what we call data tables. So again, the idea of scalability and enabling teams to create effective test coverage really easily is really helped in part by things like data tables, where I can train a test with one data set, but then run that same test across multiple data sets and even run them all in parallel. Now, as we click create test, Mabl is going to spin up our application in a fresh, clean browser instance, and off to the right is going to be our Mabl trainer. And this is really the crux of where Mabl provides a lot of value when it comes to scaling out your test coverage, because we go about it in that low-code way. And really simply put, if I were a manual tester, a Selenium expert, or an SDET, all of those different members of the team could effectively automate in a single platform, which just furthers the ability to collaborate in terms of quality. So simply walking through the application, performing some steps that a typical user might, are automatically recorded by Mabl and become test steps as we see in our trainer here. From here, I might try to log in with an invalid email. And naturally, I want to validate, am I getting the expected state or the correct behavior from my application? So what I'll do next is I'll build an assertion based on this application response, where in a very similar point and click manner, I can validate things like text or messages from the application, and I'll choose to assert here that the inner text property should be equal to some expected error message like we see below. So creating entirely new test steps is really as simple as walking through the application or even executing a manual test. But as teams get even more effective in scale, reusability becomes even more critical. So in Mabl, we have the notion of flows, which allow us to repurpose, reuse common sets of steps that we might share across multiple test scripts. So that could be login, create some record, update a record. Really anything that's going to be common across test cases is a great use case to create a flow with. And so here I'll import that flow and begin to play it back. And what this is really going to help enable is it's going to reduce the amount of time it takes to create new tests, but it's also going to help reduce maintenance. Because if something fundamental changes to how I create a record or perform one of these flows, well, rather than update 15 or 100 tests in which that flow might be used, I only need to update that in one instance to update all those tests at once. Now, there's a lot of functionality under the hood that we could kind of show in Mabl, but one area that really sets us apart is how we handle identifying elements in our application. One of the main challenges that Dan alluded to earlier was the overall maintenance efforts of typical open source solutions. What Mabl does as we create these test steps is we're gathering as much data as possible to really understand at the highest level, what does it mean to click on some span element or click on the client button. So maybe we'll capture anywhere from 20 to 40 unique identifiers, and we use all of that data in probabilistic modeling to actually enable AI to adapt the test script to changes in your application. We've even started to implement Gen AI to even further make these test steps really robust so that any test I create today, I can feel confident 2 weeks from now, a month, a year from now, that test is still going to be able to run reliably, even when a developer might have made a slight change that could impact a typical test script. And that's the notion of what we call auto-healing. And so in this example, you can see not only has a particular class attribute or IG attribute have changed, the entire front-end library was shifted from material UI to ant design library. Despite these really significant changes in the DOM, because Mabl has all of that data and it's using AI to actually develop a deeper understanding of those elements, we were still able to find the correct element. And because we track all of this data, Mabl will actually let you know when we perform these types of auto heals, and ultimately really reduce maintenance for teams upwards of 80% when looking at across sort of open source solutions. Now, the final couple of things I might call out just from a web UI testing perspective is the amount of flexibility in what these tests can be really automating in your application. And that's because we were designed around true end-to-end use cases. So whether that's adding validations against accessibility, or actually testing emails sent from our application, or validating the contents of PDFs, Mabl gives you the flexibility to really test those true end-to-end user journeys that are really focused from the user perspective. How are real users interacting with our applications? Those are the critical workflows we want to be able to effectively test and really efficiently start to automate. Now, as we start to build out these test scripts, we'll start to organize them into what we call plans. Now, plans in Mabl are really unique because we can not just organize and group similar UI tests, whether it's by feature or function, we can organize all different test types into a single test suite. And so in this example, you'll notice not only am I running a set of UI tests, but I'm also preceding those UI tests by leveraging API tests. And these two different types of tests can be really tightly integrated where perhaps I am using an API to generate some test data. And that same test data generated via API, I'm actually going to reference and use in my UI test. Finally, we can see I've set up stages to configure how these tests run. So if I need to run an additional stage to perhaps clean up after itself and delete all of that dummy test data, I can really easily do so through this test plan organization. There's a lot of benefits to taking this unified approach. When it comes to UI validations, it lets me be really efficient as API tests can run in a matter of seconds. It also allows me to expand coverage so that I'm really testing my application and exercising it from all aspects of the user experience. Now, to create API tests themselves, that is the same really intuitive, low-code sort of experience as you saw with UI testing. So here I'll actually update an existing API test. And what you'll be able to see is if I want to add an additional request as part of this API test, all I simply need to do is add a new request here, set my endpoint, and perhaps any parameters or request bodies I might need. I can go ahead and click send. And now I can start to work and validate the response data that I'm getting back from that API. Now, in this case, we can start to see all of this data. Maybe I want to build an assertion. Well, because we're low code, I only need to understand how JSON data is represented in order to work with that data. So in this case, let's add an assertion that this name property should be equal to Boston. So I'll simply reference that JSON body path, set my assertion type, and what my expected value might be. Additionally, maybe I will store another piece of data that will be later used in the UI test. Again, I'm simply referencing that JSON body path and assigning it to a variable like account ID. As I click send again, you'll notice Mabl has now stored that piece of data and added that assertion. So just from a functional testing perspective, in just about 10 minutes, I've created a UI test, an API test, and I can start to really easily organize those into a single test suite. Now, where this kind of leads to really buys into the vision of a unified platform. Since we are already leveraging a solution like Mabl to build our functional UI and API tests, we make it just as easy, if not easier, to extend our coverage into performance testing. So with those UI and API tests that I've built already, I'll now start to create a performance test where I can import one or more functional browser or API tests to run with performance metrics. Let's start with an API test where maybe I choose to import that create a client API test. We can now see how that performs under the load of, say, 500 users, and I can measure those performance metrics like response time or error rates that I might get from that API. Now, that same notion of reusability also applies to browser tests, where here I can now import an existing browser test to run with performance metrics, like perhaps a checkout flow. By importing this test, I can now run it under the load of, say, again, 500 users. And now I can measure an entirely another set of performance metrics really relevant to the UI performance perspective. So here I could set criteria like step duration should not exceed 5 seconds. But I can also measure really important metrics around things like core web vitals. Core web vitals are really how users experience page load times and overall performance. So we can measure things that not only impact user experience, but also aspects like SEO rankings. So I'll cast a rather wide net here, and I'll choose all of these different core web vitals, and I'll set some different thresholds, such as moderate for first contentful paint, but maybe for time to first byte, maybe I want to be a little bit stricter there and have a higher standard of what I'm expecting as far as overall performance. And with that, I can save this test, and I could then begin to experience and run a performance testing coverage all from that same platform. Now, as teams build out all of these different tests within a single platform like Mabl, another aspect of plans is how we use them to automate and scale. So in this example, I've chosen a different test plan, which perhaps is better suited as a regression or smoke plan. I'm going to run a series of tests in parallel across all the major browsers I might configure here. That could include Chrome, Firefox, Edge, and Safari. And because it's running in parallel, clicking run will automatically provision and create the infrastructure from Mabl to execute those tests. And we can see that being done below in real time. So we're really removing the effort that it takes to scale testing and manage infrastructure while still enabling teams to have that really great coverage and the efficiency of parallel executions. Now, I mentioned plans also allow us to automate how these tests run. And while I could run it in an ad hoc manner like I just did, I could also have this automated on different triggers. In this case, I have it set to run on a schedule like Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 6. It could be a timer every 12 hours. Or because we integrate with so many different CI/CD tools, and because we have APIs and webhooks, you can seamlessly plug this into whatever CI/CD tool you're using so that anytime a developer might deploy a change, create a pull request, we can trigger these tests to run and actually act as gates within those pipelines. So in another example here, we could take a look at my Azure DevOps pipeline where I've used that native plugin to automatically trigger tests alongside these pipeline executions. We can see a summary of the test runs that happen as these pipelines are executed. And based on this pass-fail in 100% pass rate, I as a developer can feel really confident, not just about my ability to move this new feature out to production, but about the overall quality of that new feature. Now, from here, the final piece that might be worth kind of talking through is, well, what happens if a test does fail? It's really important to understand, the output of these tests, because not every pipeline execution here is going to be all green. And that's really the purpose of what we're doing with quality and testing, is to catch those bugs as early as possible. What Mabl provides is a lot of really rich data so that teams can understand as a test runs, well, what was the application state? And in the event of a failure, we want to be able to quickly understand, well, did this test fail because of an actual regression or bug? And so in this case, you can see we provide all sorts of data like screenshots where we're actually flagging visual changes. We also capture even deeper data in the logs like network activity and DOM snapshots, as well as additional performance metrics. Now, this data can be really helpful when you're trying to triage or troubleshoot a test, where in this instance, maybe I want to trace my application state from the beginning to the end of my test, where I can see even though we failed on step 6, the root cause of this failure might be actually where we passed with a warning. I can investigate things like the console logs or the network responses to understand, well, it looks like I had a 402 in the network here. And as I scan through that network file, I can actually view the individual API requests that led to that failure. So in a couple of minutes, I've been able to look at a test result and identify this particular failure as an actual bug or environment issue. I've captured the actual API request that might be the root cause of that failure. And then better yet, because we have integrations with Jira, we can automatically create issues from these failed tests. And so with a few clicks, and by providing a little bit more context to that particular bug or ticket, I can automatically publish these Jira issues or defects, while not only generating that ticket for you, but actually pushing all of those really helpful insights and artifacts to that ticket while linking back to the test result in Mabl. Now, the final thing to talk about when we think about the overall sort of view of testing and where Mabl kind of plays into the picture is how do I understand my overall testing efforts? So Mabl provides a lot of insights and data around our overall testing activity, not just in the dashboards like I showed you earlier, but in additional reporting dashboards like our release coverage page. This is really helpful for those that may be individual testers, to QA managers, to executive level leadership. If you want to understand our overall level of testing and our overall level of quality for a given release, this makes it really easy to set filters based on a certain release or sprint. So maybe the last 30 days against a given application in a given environment. Based on those filters, we can see really interesting data around our overall pass rates or cumulative test runs, which is how many tests have we actually executed or unique tests have been run within that 30 days. We'll track additional metrics around our browser tests, where we're again providing non-functional insights around performance. Even though this test has been run several times, we've noticed that there's been a little bit of a decrease in terms of the overall performance there. And then we get more high-level data around the overall trending run history, average app load time, categorized failures, and then the ability to go a little bit more granular and look at individual tests and their associated pass rates, executions, or performance changes. Now, the final piece before I open it up for Q&A would be to kind of understand how do we plug into your entire ecosystem. Mabl is really focused on being the best in class end-to-end intelligent automation solution, but we know we need to work with all the other tools within your ecosystem. So we talked about a lot of these CI/CD tools that make it really simple to start to plug and play into your pipelines, but we also integrate with those Jira issue tracking tools, as well as communication tools like Slack or Teams. So if we want to create visibility around the pass-fail results or the interesting insights Mabl provides, we can easily push notifications to dedicated channels so that everyone is aware of our overall quality efforts. Hopefully this was a helpful walkthrough of the Mabl platform, from test creation, organization, to insights and reporting. But I'd love to take the last, I believe, 8 minutes to address any open questions the team or the folks viewing us might have.
Yes, yeah, thank you for the good demo, and it shows a lot of possibilities of Mabl. And you also described that the tool is capable of handling different technologies like API and web, but also desktop, I believe. Now, I was wondering, can you also combine those things into one single test? Because you gave the example that you do an API test, then do a web test. But can you combine both in one test?
Yeah, that's a great question. So while I sort of showed a standalone API test, we could just as easily make API calls as part of a UI test as well. So a very similar sort of interface where if as part of my UI test, maybe I create some data like a client and I want to validate, does that client exist now on the back end? As part of this test, I could include a step that makes an API call to that back end. So the short answer is yes, and it's a very strong use case for Mabl to be able to validate UI and API all from a single test. Does that help address your question, Frederick?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Awesome.
Great. There's another question from Stan. Is there support for direct database checks SQL queries?
Yeah, Stan, that's a great question. Today, we don't natively support database connections. That's why we do have, we've tried to develop a very robust offering around APIs to help mitigate that. But the good news is we are really focused on constant innovation. And because of that, one of the very first things on the roadmap for 2024 is actually looking to invest in adding database support. So of course, being so early in still 2023, my product team would not be very happy with me if I gave any sort of timeline. But I will say it's on our roadmap and something I'm personally very excited to get my hands on and in front of customers.
Yeah, Andy, you stole the words right out of my mouth. It was actually announced at our recent conference that Mabl hosted, the Mabl Experience, and publicly announced on our roadmap.
Yeah. You know, while we're on that topic, Dan, one thing we didn't even touch upon yet because we are just now in the private beta testing phase, but the same experience for testing web UI components will soon be offered for native mobile testing for both iOS and Android, where you can actually test those APK files in those native mobile apps in the same low-code experience, where you'll be able to scale these same tests across a multitude of different device profiles, whether it's Android or iPhones.
Great.
I know it looks like you had a question.
Yep.
Is self-healing feature only possible with the web-based testing, or is it also possible within mobile or API testing? So it's a good question, Arno. For API testing, because we're being so explicit around, I'm validating this given endpoint, and I'll pull up the API testing interface so that we can kind of have some context here. Because I'm being so explicit with, I'm creating a variable based on this JSON property, there's no ability to necessarily auto-heal around changes in the response format. But that same self-healing that you see in UI testing will also be applied to native mobile testing. So we're using the same type of probabilistic AI modeling to really enable a really low maintenance automation framework.
Great. Any other questions? Frederick, you have another question?
Yes, indeed. I saw that you demonstrated the low coding idea. That's really helpful when creating your test. But I can imagine that sometimes there are things that are a little bit more complicated and are not easily being set up by click and play. Is there also a possibility to write your own scripts or pieces of code? And if yes, in which type of language is it possible?
Yeah, that's a really good call out, Frederick. And you're absolutely right. Low code will, almost always, get us 95, 98% of the way there. But there's always edge cases where maybe I need to provide a little bit more granular or specific programmatic logic to the test. And that's why Mabl is low code, but not no code. So I can, using JavaScript, execute some custom code as part of a test. And some examples you might see is compare compute costs, or here, maybe I would need to generate a date dynamically using a specific date format. You can notice I can automatically start to execute and import that bit of code as a reusable snippet. But anyone would be able to author or write these code snippets that then become reusable, so that not only is it accessible to those with a coding background, but those manual testers or business analysts, they can just as easily leverage that same bit of coding function within their test through that reusability. Does that help address your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Great. I think we're through the most questions and also through the time. So thanks so much for this demo and explanation.